Content over everything.
For example, 5 different political parties, and all of them have different sets of issues they support, and there's overlap between 2 parties, then it's perfectly reasonable for 2 parties to discuss with each other how to make the particular issues they support sort of overlap each other. I mean, that essentially there's certain issues that you want to get through, and your job as a party is to develop issues that support your base, and then do whatever it takes to get those issues through government. If 2 different parties have decided that they sort of support similar issues, at least in a fraction of their overall manifesto, it's perfectly legitimate for them to collaborate together to try and make those issues. And let's say you develop a particular policy that makes your underlying base win, and then someone else develops a policy that's kind of similar, but it doesn't quite get in the way. Is there any way to develop a third policy that actually...
They did this. Clinton invented this. It's called triangulation. It's one of the most basic forms of strategy. Tony Blair did it very well as well. It's a strategy of taking what the opposition is saying, finding the middle ground between that and your views, and then going for that policy. Rather than actually sticking with your principles, even if you may not win.
Yeah.
You compromise your integrity as a politician and a party. And you might win. You might win.
Yeah.
You're actually more likely to win. But the thing is that you, in the long run, compromise your integrity as a party.
And if you end up in a situation, where all the parties are saying the exact same thing, it's not really democracy as well.
Why do you think it's very difficult today? So let's pretend Jeremy Corbyn hasn't happened. But it was very difficult for a long time to tell the difference between Labour and Tories.
Yeah.
People even jokingly call it Lib-Lab-Con. You know, Liberal Democrats, Labour, and Conservatives. They saw it as one kind of entity.
Yeah.
I can see why. I mean, you said earlier you could see Jeremy Corbyn bringing through a Countryside Living Allowance.
Well, I don't know.
But I don't think you could have seen that beforehand. You wouldn't have seen that a few years ago.
One thing Jeremy Corbyn does support, I mean, I don't know about the Countryside Living Allowance, but one thing Jeremy Corbyn does support is compulsory purchases of farmland that does not have planning permission for development. Just compulsory purchasing that at the cost of agricultural land, and then building social housing on it.
So why doesn't he just build social housing where it's needed most? So places where there's a housing crisis, like London.
Well, you have to buy the land first.
Yeah. So what? I mean, this is what.
So the thing is, the question is, you got a certain amount of tax revenue from the government. The government has a certain amount of tax revenue, and there's a certain amount of houses that needs to be built. Now, the less money you spend, the less tax revenue you spend building those houses, the more houses you can build. Because building less houses, building less social housing versus building more social housing means that less people get houses.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So property owners tend not to like social housing in their area because it brings their property values down a lot of times.
That's fine though. You basically don't. You need to override those kind of vested interests. Like this is what. Okay, Labour in the 70s didn't achieve everything it wanted to.
Yeah.
But that idea of building, creating mixed neighbourhoods, so there's social housing and private housing in the same area. I mean, I know this from near where my brother lives in Chelsea.
Yeah.
You see this. It's very mixed and it's good.
Yeah.
It creates a healthy balance. So you don't have these sort of, areas which are just homogenous. I think that's much healthier than having. And you could do that. You could do that by law. Just buy that land and you build those houses.
Yeah. I mean, it depends how. I mean, I guess yes. I mean, that's the thing. Kind of. Do you pay the full price for the house and then turn it into social housing in sort of a speckled way? Or do you compulsorily purchase farmland and build at very low prices and build lots of houses in an area that's maybe not ideal, but essentially you're spending less money on the land, you can build more houses. So there's a case for doing both, I suppose. But if you buy land on the cheap, then you can build more houses on that land. So if there's a certain amount of houses that are required, then the more houses you can build, the more pressure you take off the housing market.
This is someone who's also concerned about Britain's environment. Our loss. Britain doesn't already have that many different types of species compared to other parts of the world. So it's worrying to hear someone suggest we take over more green land, green space. That could be left over to nature and look, we need to share this island basically is what I'm saying with its inhabitants who've been here far longer than we have. They deserve the space to develop and grow their natural, potential. Not done enough what? Damage or
the distance? I mean, you're right. It is cheaper to buy unused land to build social housing. But if the people living in the social housing have to commute for extensively long distances to get to where they make an income, yes, you've given them a house, but you've also created another problem. And that's happening. They see a lot of that in the U.S., where the actual commute to work is more of a detriment to the fact that you have to live outside, and it's kind of a kind of optimistic gentrification, because the poorer you are, the likelier you're further to move out.
Yeah. So I mean, the answer might be a mix. Like, to a certain extent, you kind of want to bulk up the amount of houses out there, but at the same time, you also want to kind of, or an alternative would actually be to have compulsory purchase orders at the agricultural land, build a load of houses, the government build a load of houses, and then just sell those houses at the full house price. That could just generate tax revenue, and then you could use that tax revenue to buy social housing all over the place.
What about generally trying to municipalize all property in a neighborhood? So not just housing, but businesses, enterprises, to bring that under the control of the local council. That's surely more democratic, because you have some influence over your local council. They're somewhat accountable. Corporations are not accountable to you at all. It's better. I'd rather have more houses. I'd rather have a neighborhood where all the houses and businesses are owned by the local council, rather than one where it's all owned by corporations, which are not accountable to us, are they? They're private entities.
I've thought about a situation where you have land value tax over the entire town. So you don't charge the cost of the improvements. The improvements are the cost of producing the improvements. So if a house costs £50,000 to build, or maybe if a house costs £70,000 to build, but you can buy that house for £170,000, that means the value of the land beneath the house is worth £100,000, and then the rent would be about 3% of that, maybe £3,000 per annum. So the government, in a land value tax, if you had a house that cost £70,000 to build, but £170,000 to buy, the land value tax that they'd have to pay the government would be about £3,000, and under those situations, the land value tax would actually reduce the cost of buying the property to about £70,000.
Would they pay that to the local council? They pay that to the state. Who would collect? Doesn't matter.
It changes things, but which one is more preferable is I
think the local council. I think, to be honest, local councils have been deprived enough of funds as it is.
Yeah.
If they're going to get some kind of new tax reform, such as a land value tax, it would make more sense for the revenue to go to them, no? Because that's where, they're losing. I mean, it's like Jeremy Corbyn said in a speech recently. We don't have enough development of our youth services in London, which leads to more crime. When people don't have enough to do, they do. The lack of youth services is because of lack of funding to local councils. It's not because of lack of funding to the state. So I think, if you're going to advocate, John, any particular entity to enforce this tax and also this Countryside Living Allowance, I think it would be better if it was the local council.
I've thought about a situation where businesses and corporations or whatever were by default had to pay a land value tax, but they could be exempt if they engaged in like pro-social activity, like, I don't know, giving away surplus food to the poor or whatever. They could essentially be exempt from that, or letting people use the toilets without having customers only in the toilets, that kind of thing.
So socializing part of their business somehow.
Well, essentially, no. It's more a social incentive to private business owners, so that private business owners can either pay the land value tax, or essentially, if the people in the area can essentially give corporations a black mark and say, if we don't like you, you got to pay the land value tax. And if people, hi.
Yeah, sorry, I just joined the conversation.
Hello.
What's the topic?
The Countryside Living Allowance. The idea is that a universal basic income of £5,000 a year. Some people have suggested universal basic income of £10,000 a year times 50 million people in Great Britain is £50 billion. A universal basic income of £5,000 a year times 50 million people is £250 billion. Now, the Countryside Living Allowance suggests paying only those who live in the countryside that are willing to pay land value tax on the property they hold, a basic income of £5,000. And since only 20% of people live in the countryside, that would reduce the cost of the Countryside Living Allowance to something more like £40 billion. So it's a big cash saving.
Okay.
And the other.
So what would you use the money for? What would the money?
What would people use it? You just give it to people. You just give it to people. You give it to anyone in the countryside that agrees to pay land value tax on their holdings on all their UK holdings. And since and land value tax is about maybe 3 or 4% of the value of land per year. So if you have land that's worth £10,000, then whose undeveloped cost was worth £10,000, then you'd pay about 4% of that to the government. So you pay £400 to the government.
So is this policy to like trying to help society to be more equal, or?
Yes.
All right, okay.
Yes. Essentially, Henry George. I'll read this.
Yeah.
Henry George talked about this thing called the law of wages.
Yeah.
And he wrote.
Yeah, because the society we live in now is very, very unequal, you know.
Yes.
And the disparity, you know, the gap between the rich and poor is getting wider and wider.
Yes. And a really interesting thing is that not that many economists have ever heard of the law of wages, and it seems to me that actually that raising wages is one of the single most important things that you can do, really, and yet a lot of economists don't even know about it. Henry George, this is a really good quote from Henry George. What, in the conditions of freedom, will be the terms at which one man can hire others to work for him? Evidently, they will be fixed by what the men could make if labouring for themselves on free land.
Yeah.
The principle which will prevent him from having to give anything above this, except what is necessary to induce the change, will also prevent them from taking anything less. Did they demand more, the competition from others would prevent them from getting employment. Did he offer less, none would accept the terms, as they could obtain greater results by working for themselves. So if you work to supply your own needs, then you don't need to. Then nobody needs to employ you.
The problem I have is with big companies and big corporations, because they earn their turnover every year is millions, hundreds of millions of pounds, and they refuse to increase the wages of the workers. So when I did my research, 90% of the big companies don't pay their workers a fair wage, and most of their workers are struggling to pay their bills. You see, there's only about 10% of the companies that actually pay a fair wage. You see, so that must change for society to be more equal, for the distribution of income between the rich and poor, the gap between the rich and poor, to be closed. The gap between that needs to be closed, because there's no other way, that can change. Social mobility. They've talked about social mobility. But what political commitment have they put behind that? You see,
social mobility is the lottery. With social mobility, you get a few people win the lottery, and then the government hold them up and say, "Hey, look, anyone can make it," and 95% of people are still like right at the bottom. Exactly. And all this social mobility, it's a cop out.
That's why what you have now is, I don't know if you can refer to it as a brain drain. Yeah. Lots of teachers, I've had friends that are teachers, lecturers, they live in England, they're going to Dubai, UAE, other countries outside, because their pay package and their living conditions is a better deal over there.
Yeah.
You see? So what does that do? In fact, that you lose good teachers, you lose people that have the skills to contribute to different sectors and industries.
Yeah.
And it affects the society over here, because you don't have those skills are like very difficult to build up over a certain period of time. It's like what's going to happen with Brexit too, and so many other things like that.
Another really big problem with the national minimum wage is that it doesn't take account of the expenses in a minimum wage in Doncaster, a job that gives you a minimum.
To me, the minimum wage is useless, because now at the moment, especially if you live in London, I'm working nights. I have to work a night shift because I earn more money when I work in nights to be able to cover my bills. You see, and I've been working for 17 years, and I'm still trying to break through.
Yeah.
You see, so if I'm working for 17 years and I've lived in UK for 17 years, how much more difficult is it going to be for people who've just emigrated over here? It's going to be so much more difficult for them. So when they say a fair society, how can you tell me that's a fair society? Listen, there's nothing fair about it. Social society,
Social mobility, the whole idea of social mobility is to placate people. It's basically like, you got about 95% of people who live at the bottom, who are going to stay at the bottom for the whole life. 5% might make it up.
Yeah.
And the whole idea of social mobility is to basically say, hey,
So it's a flawed policy. It's a flawed policy.
Just tolerate your really shitty conditions,
Yeah.
because sooner or later you're going to make it. Because look at Joe over there.
Yeah.
He started out of the bottom and he made it good.
5% is nothing,
Yeah.
compared to 95%.
Yeah.
So
most people never go up. Just because a few people can get
not
up.
even most people don't go up. Their generations and second generation and third generations are still stuck. I lived in Manchester for 7 years.
Yeah.
And I went to University of Salford. And when I got there, I was shocked, because when I lived in London and I moved to Manchester, I never ever thought that I would see poverty in England. And I saw poverty there, and I can mention the areas. I'm talking about Rochdale, I'm talking about Oldham, I'm talking about areas that are like people, you could see the children, were deprived, of basic facilities and essential services. So politicians need to get their heads out of wherever they stick them. Yeah, they need to address the issues of the people, common people. You see, and I don't know about Labour, I don't know about Conservative, but we need politicians, that can do the right thing. They have a conscience, and that are ready to change society. When you talk about all the great men and politicians that have been in the past, why after 20 years, 50 years, 100 years, do people still talk about them? Because they left a legacy. And I haven't seen any politician in the last 20, 30 years that has a legacy to leave. Where is Mr. David Cameron today? No one has seen him. After Brexit, he's disappeared into Holland Park, into his house, and he's refused to come to public.
Yeah.
You see? So is that a leader? Is that someone that you can call a legacy leader? No
Absolutely
way. He
not.
has no legacy.
Brexit is the legacy,
All he
and
did
it's
was
not clear
introduce
that's not benefiting
austerity.
anyone either.
He's introduced austerity and messed up life for ordinary people. We don't need those kind of leaders. We need radical thinkers.
Yes.
That's what we need.
Yes.
And I challenge any politician in the UK at the moment to come up with policies that would affect the betterment of people in society.
If you give people the option to provide for themselves if you give people a income, if you give people who live in the countryside an income to farm and provide for themselves, they don't need to work for anyone else.
Exactly.
And the thing is, once people have the option, once people can live a decent life farming and working for themselves, the really interesting thing is, when you make money, you're competing against other people. When you save money, you're not competing. And the non-competitive aspect of saving money means that essentially an infinite number of people can do it. So once a Countryside Living Allowance secures a certain amount of lifestyle in the countryside, anyone in the city who's living below that lifestyle can go into the countryside and let's say piano playing makes a lot of money and people learn how to play the piano. Well, if you have lots and lots of piano players, the amount you can make playing the piano goes down because the supply goes up and the demand stays the same. But with saving money, with working to save money, when you got a Countryside Living Allowance, more and more people can go in. It doesn't affect the amount people can get.
It has to change, because in France it changed.
Yeah.
You see, and the current president started with a movement that was either left or right. It cannot continue to remain the same.
Yeah.
You had the riots a couple of years ago. If care is not taken, there's going to be riots again, because people are going to get to that point. They're so frustrated, it's going to boil over. So the local elections that are coming up on the May 3rd or 4th, there's so much voter apathy. Young people are not interested because the politicians keep on saying the same old thing and do nothing about it. They make big promises, but they do nothing about it when they get elected into office. So we need a radical change, a paradigm shift.
Yeah.
Get rid of all those old politicians that talk rubbish, and let's see politicians that do things for the common people of society.
They wouldn't be allowed.
Yeah.
That wouldn't
Why?
be allowed in
Why?
this country.
So why
I'll tell you why it won't be allowed.
in a free society.
I'll tell you why. There used to be a Marxist in the park, right? And, he's been here 20 years, he's Heiko. And he was talking about supporting Jeremy Corbyn. And he had this German bloke at the side of him, right? One of his supporters. And when the meeting ended, I said to this German bloke, if the powerful lobby, the Jewish lobby, does not want Jeremy Corbyn to be Prime Minister, he won't be Prime Minister. And I said, I was emphatic. I said this to him twice, and he didn't take any notice. You will not be allowed in politics to get any position of power if the Board of Deputies of British Jews is against you. Right, and now, apart from them, we've got Islam as well. So you're not going to win. You've got to do it yourself.
I'm not Jeremy Corbyn. I'm
No.
not any of them.
Yeah.
Because they're all rich men. Basically, they all live in £1 million property homes, and they don't know what the common people go through. They don't know what people live in council estates go to. They don't know what people that have to wake up 6 o'clock in the morning and go to work.
Yeah.
No, they don't. They have no clue.
But you've got
You
to
see?
change your life and those around you.
Of course.
And but don't expect you're going to be allowed to be in positions of power. Change your life, change yourself, change those around you, because the truth will
But
out.
what I'm saying is they shouldn't come and
Yeah.
tell me,
No.
oh, I'm different from the other guy. Because they're all the same.
Labour Conservative.
They're all in the same. They're swimming, they're birds of the same feather. They flock
both
together.
against the Syrian government, which is the only secular government in that region, and they both believe these fake chemical attacks. They're terrible.
The other thing is that if you want to actually make a change in society, you have to know how the relationship between policies and results works. And economics is the study that tells you how policies will affect results. And this is the thing that amazes me, is that back in 1879, Henry George wrote this thing called the Law of Wages that basically said the way wages are set by what people can make for working without wages. So if you work in the countryside and produce a certain amount in nature, there's actually natural wealth in nature, and you can provide benefit for yourself in nature. And if you have a little bit of money on top to get tools to actually work and farm and maybe even build your own house, that kind of stuff.
The thing is, like what you're saying is okay, you live in a free society. Why can't I grow my own tomatoes and vegetables and carrots and fruits? You understand? Yeah, exactly. Because I'm restricted by land. I can't own land.
You gotta have land.
You see? So why am I allowing Tesco and Sainsbury's to dictate to me what kind of fruit I have to eat, what I have to put in my body?
System,
you see?
It's
all controlled. It's a controlled system.
The enclosure system, the rich got the land, and it was taken from the country people, and they had to go and live in the towns. It was thievery on a large scale.
See, and it's been going on for centuries. And it's going to continue going on if people don't stand up and make that change, demand that change. Yeah. Because this is not South Korea. This is not North Korea. This is England. This is a free country. Exactly.
A book that's really worth reading is Henry George, Progress and Poverty. That's exactly what he says. He says that essentially if something isn't produced by a person, then it belongs to everyone. Essentially, there's two kinds of income. There's income that proceeds from labour, and the income that proceeds from labour belongs to the person who provides that value with his labour. And then there's income that proceeds from natural scarcity. So if you've got a really nice beach and you say, I want to use that beach or whatever, then a lot of other people want to use that beach, and you're deciding who's going to use it and who isn't going to use it. That's a natural scarcity of a desirable location, and people will pay rent and income to get to that location. And this income that proceeds from natural scarcity should be distributed among everyone. Everyone has the same right to the naturally scarce resources of nature that have not been produced through the work of any individual. And that's essentially what Henry George says. He says that the rental value that is associated with location and natural scarcity should be distributed to everyone. And that essentially, you can do that. We all need our personal space, right? We all need personal space. We all need to live somewhere. But what he says is that people should not have the right to declare ownership of land in perpetuity, that essentially you pay a rent to use the land per year, and that rent goes to the state. And obviously once you're paying the rent, people can't break into your house any more than if you're a tenant in a house, people can't break into your house, that kind of stuff. If you rent a place for the period where you rent it, that's your space, but you've got to pay the rent to the government, and you've got to pay the rent to society, and that should be distributed back throughout society. If you collect all land rents, all the rents associated with land, and take that rental income and distribute that out to everyone in society as a universal basic income, that's the equivalent of giving every member of society the same right to the natural value of the resources of our planet, and that's justice.
Well, I don't want those resources and money from that going to the Jehovah's Witnesses or the Muslims or those people. I mean, there are going to be these special interest groups that create a lot of trouble and demand that share out of proportion to what they should have of these resources. Well, that's why you have to have private ownership of land by individuals and families, and not the Rothschilds and not big business, because it doesn't. Your system doesn't work. It doesn't work because the state always gives in to powerful pressure groups.
Well, this is the advantage of a universal basic income. That if you just pay everyone, if you just pay everyone a set income, then it's a very simple policy and it's very fair. Interest groups can't really influence the decision-making process if there is no decision-making process to influence. That's the big thing. You need to make something really, really simple, and you need to hammer it down. So collect all land rents, pay all the land rents out as universal basic income. You can collect maybe a bit of other stuff from income tax to fund public services, but just collect if you collect all the natural scarcity value to do with like the location value of land and distribute that out to everyone, that's the equivalent to giving everyone an equal share of the land. So essentially, if you have this universal basic income, if that comes from land rents, then by definition, you will be able to rent out your share of land, because the universal basic income will pay for you to rent your share of land. Although you might have to make some extra money, working to live above that. But it'll improve what everyone can make. It'll improve everyone's quality of life.
What's your name, sir?
All right.
What's your name?
John McCone.
Content over everything from your Come, man, say it straight. Man, don't listen to BBC. Man, don't listen to ITV. Prayer circle, bro. Yeah. Blood, yeah. Man, just urge it. Man's been away for the part for. What's wrong with me, fam? I can't this guy. Stop drinking, blood. No, joking, man. Yeah. Yeah, you don't know. We got the people them, you get me? But it's a serious thing, yeah, cause this is a real infringement on human rights.